So this week we looked at 3 articles, one about Peter the Great, one about Catherine the Great, and one about the history of Russia from Peter's time till the time of Napoleon. The articles about Peter the Great and Catherine the Great consisted mainly of descriptions of their characters from people who had met them on their travels through Europe or in the court at Russia. They described things like Peter's affinity for shipbuilding, his strange tics, his drinking habits. An observer comments on Catherine the Great that while her ambition and cunning may take her far, her love affairs might prove to be her undoing. What interests me here is this recurring theme, I guess, of what traits make you a good ruler versus what traits make you a good person, and those are 2 very different things. Peter may have been interested in building ships and studying Europe and making his country more like Europe, and that might have been good for a normal person. You can be interested in the workings of another culture, and you can want to be more like them. However, if you're a ruler of an entire country, then when you get that power, that leads to you doing things that a normal person might not be able to do, and if you're very passionate about something, that can end up with you causing a lot of damage, as Peter the Great did. The people commenting on Peter's personality traits are commenting on 2 different things, and they switch back and forth between those 2 things. One is the things that they notice about him, the things they notice him doing, what makes him a person, things that he's interested in, things that he has a habit of doing, how he gets so drunk and maybe crashes at a place and completely ruins that person's house. Those are traits that he is as a person, and as just one person, that isn't very harmful. He can be rude and snobbish and annoying and a bore, and that's not good, of course, but not something that's dangerous. And the other half of the time, what the people are noticing, they're worrying about what it's going to mean for Russia, that he may be ambitious in certain ways, or likes European culture a little too much for someone who's going to be the symbol of Russia, or treats his hosts very badly and has no respect for their houses. All of those things, once you have those traits in a ruler, become on a much larger scale, really, and they affect the entire history or future of a country. This is also true with Catherine. She had many lovers, and while a normal person might or might not have been able to get away with that, what she did was she made sure Russia couldn't get away with it, not just her, because she would appoint them as officers and people in important positions of power. And they, when they were spurned, would end up getting demoted and maybe would get angry about that, as quite a few of them did, and this would have repercussions, because if they weren't speaking to each other, if Catherine was not willing to speak to a particular advisor of hers because he happened to be her lover, and they had a falling out, then that would mean that certain state affairs would not get discussed that day. People in her own government, if they had grudges against her because she had been their lover, then they would not talk to her, and they might actually pose a security threat to her, which often happened. And a normal person would have been able to flee their lovers, and they would be able to probably not have as many affairs. And so her position of power, who she was as a leader, in other words, affected her own personal life, and vice versa. So those are my thoughts on Peter and Catherine and what their personalities say about what it means to be a ruler. The 3rd article we read covered the history of Russia from the time of Peter the Great to the invasion of Napoleon. Napoleon had been a threat to Russia for a long time, and while the French forces, when they finally did invade, faced very harsh conditions, they were still a force to be reckoned with. They headed towards Moscow, and the Russian military leaders had very limited options. There was no way they could beat the French forces in Moscow. There was no way they could protect the city, so instead they decided to abandon it. They evacuated as many people as possible out of the city, and destroyed all the supplies and provisions left in it so that the French army could not benefit from having stopped the city. The French army had come this far without having fought a battle, and when they reached Moscow, they were depending on having that city to rest and replenish their supplies. And they didn't get that, which took a lot of the force out of their attack, and basically is what made them lose the battle. Whenever this is described, it is portrayed as this heroic decision that people made that saved Russia, and it is commended and praised and treated as a victorious move that basically won the war. But that's really not how it was seen at the time. What we pass over is the fact that the Emperor, Alexander I, took a lot of the blame for having abandoned Moscow because people saw it as an abandonment of tradition and the heritage of that city, sacrificing it to the French and burning it to the ground so that the French couldn't win. And while that did, yes, win the war, a lot of people were annoyed about it and angry about it, even furious. And Alexander, who had been a hero saving his country, took a lot of the blame for that. Everyone was very harsh about it towards him, and they didn't believe that he had actually helped them. They were angry that he had caused them to abandon the city that was so precious to them. When we learn history, we don't always look at how people at the time treated events that were going on. We don't always look at how the historical figures that we praise so much and glorify so much today, how they benefited from their actions, what the results were, what their lives were like after, and what the response was towards them for their actions. And in treating this event like a triumph, we ignore the fact that the people who caused it to be what it was, the people who allowed it to happen and saved their country, didn't get to benefit from that appreciation. So those are my thoughts on those 3 articles. Hopefully I'll see you next week.